Hello, this is Mary Kole with the Good Story Podcast, all about the writing life, the publishing life, and everything in between. I want to thank our Good Story Company team. You can learn more about us at goodstorycompany.com, and I'm thrilled to bring you today's show. Here's to a good story. Hello. This is Mary Kole with Good Story Podcast, and here I am with debut author of women's fiction thriller, Heather Dixon. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you for having me. I am, as you mentioned, a debut author. My book is coming out in August. Um, I also have a degree in English literature, so I've been a reader and writer my whole life, and just started seriously focusing on novel writing in about 2018. Um, so my book Burlington is about a mother of two young girls who moves to an affluent neighborhood with her husband and her kids, and she quits her job, ready to start a new chapter in her life. But when she gets settled, she quickly gets caught up in the drama and the lies of the rich and beautiful mothers at her daughter's new school. And soon after, one of her only friends in the area goes missing. So she then has to take a harder, longer look at who these women are and if she wants to be a part of their world.
That is awesome, and I think we'll talk about women's fiction and sort of what you see as the hallmarks for that category. But I do have this leading theory that a lot of women who are drawn to these stories are having a shift in their lives. You know, they're getting married and changing roles, they're becoming mothers and changing roles, they're getting divorced, they're leaving a job, they're getting a job, and so that identity piece is I think pretty crucial to the category. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it was the idea for this came from me um, moving to a new neighborhood and bringing my kids to school and sort of seeing this whole new world that uh, I hadn't been a part of yet. I was a mom of a young kid, but there was this whole like kind of dynamic that I didn't understand, and so I just sort of wanted to explore it.
Yeah, and well, we'll talk about your book in a second.
Yeah.
Let's rewind and talk about getting there, because you've had we were talking before we started rolling here. You've had a little bit of a unconventional or a non-mainstream path to your debut novel. So please take it away.
Yeah. So I started writing in about 2018. And what I did first was just wrote a book without knowing what I was doing at all. So I had been a reader all my life, so I thought I could do this. And I just sort of put whatever on the page that, I thought was supposed to be there. Um, and I started querying it about a year later. I did go through the process of like, readers and editing um, but then I queried it and realized kind of early on that it was not ready. So um, I set it aside and started working on the next book. So I wrote two more books, and it was the pitch for the third book that I wrote that got noticed in PitMad, which was a Twitter
Nice.
event. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the editor at the small publisher um, that picked me up in Canada, they requested it and then eventually offered me a deal. And so I kind of skipped the agent route and went directly to small publisher in Canada. But I think my process it was just a lot of practice with writing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I would write and write, and actually in there as well, when I realized I didn't understand anything about craft, I then picked up as many craft books as I possibly could get my hands on
Yeah.
and studied, Save the Cat and Story Genius and creating character arcs. So I took little bits from every craft book that I read to sort of come to understand how to put a book together.
And that structure piece is crucial with any kind of thriller elements. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but it sounds like you pantsed your way through your first book, maybe your second. And it wasn't until a little bit later where you started being more intentional with some of the choices and discovering that structure underpins all of these things. So was it like the blinds being thrown open and things started clicking at that point?
Yes, I think one thing I did notice was I would get feedback on the other books, and even on the third book that eventually ended up getting acquired. But a lot of the feedback was around pacing, and
Mm.
I do remember someone also so kindly told me that I really needed to, hit those beats, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I don't even know what beats are, and so I was really I was really just thought I could just write without knowing the actual craft. So that was the point where I went and started to really study what had to be where and when to
Hmm.
to keep a reader's interest.
Yeah, I think there's a quote, and I'm gonna misappropriate it to like Flannery O'Connor or something, that says, "Everybody thinks they know what story is until they sit down to write one."
Yes. Oh yes. That would be me.
It's a learning curve, but it sounds like you found your stride once you unlocked these structural aspects. And were you always writing in kind of the same vein of women's fiction, mystery thriller, suspense, or were some of your initial projects in a different category?
I've always tended to write more like women's fiction. I'm really into character driven as opposed to plot. So I think for me, the first thing I think about is who I want to tell a story about.
Yeah.
Um, and I would say I tend to really the first idea that comes out of me is usually quiet. It's like a quiet type of book. Um, and then I need to, especially with like Burlington, the book that's coming out, I would say, it's more suspense, I think, than thriller, but it definitely needs those plot points and that proper pacing. And I was more writing along women's fiction before that.
So, how would you define a quiet story? Because I think everybody has a slightly different idea of what is high concept, what is upmarket, and all of these terms float around. But I want to ask because everybody kind of has their own flavor.
Yeah. Well, I'm in a Twitter group with some writing friends, and we all for a while felt like uh, we were all writing quiet because uh, it we would joke around and say like it feels like nothing huge is happening, but like when we were writing it, writing our stories, we felt like big things were happening. But I think
Hmm.
as you write more and more, you realize that the stakes have to be quite high, and the action has to be quite exaggerated, or from real life. I
Yeah.
think quiet to me would be, less about like car chases and dead bodies and that kind of thing, and more about, an internal struggle, I
Yeah.
think.
But I think for women's fiction or suspense with a primary female character, you do have to have that depth, but it has to. I think stakes is really it because even if it feels like something big is happening, the plot has to also, you have to give the character something external, commensurate with that inner struggle.
Yes, 100%. And I think that's that's something that is really tricky to figure out as a when you just start writing. And for me, I think it took writing 3 books before I could really understand how to do it properly.
And your third book, you keep referencing and you're like, "Oh, that's the one that got attention." It would it then become your debut or was the third book
Yeah.
a stepping stone?
No, yeah. So the third book I wrote is the one that's going to become, the debut. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about the direct to publishing path. And I think for our listeners who might not be familiar, there is a thriving kind of indie publisher scene in Canada. And there's it's not really analogous to the US publishing market. There are tons of indie presses in the US, but Canada has just a really notable small press community. Um,
Mhm.
and so yeah, describe sort of what it's been like to go directly to a small press, what that has been like. Have you ever, do you feel like you're missing out on anything, or is there, are you thinking maybe, okay, maybe an agent next time, maybe the US market? And I'm not saying US or agents are better in any way, shape, or form, but it's sort of like, okay, are you happy, or is this something you'll build on? What are you thinking?
Yeah. Well, I have, as I mentioned, that Twitter group of writing friends, and one of my friends in the group uh, has an agent and got a deal with one of the big five publishers, and her book just came out in June. So we were sort of going along the same path at the same time. Only I was with a small publisher, and she was with, big five. And what surprised me was a lot of our journeys seemed to be quite similar up until the point when the book came out. So, we both, had the structural development edits and, copy edits and had arcs sent out. And um, a lot of that was similar. And then now that her book has come out, she's like, going on book tours and giving talks and things like that. And so I think that stage of it is the only side that would likely be a little bit different with a small publisher. So to me, I was quite surprised to learn that it is very much like a traditional publisher, just on a smaller scale.
Yeah,
And so the marketing and publicity will be on a smaller scale as well. Um, but it has been like a great experience. I've felt really happy with everything that's happened. The cover design I got to collaborate on.
it's a gorgeous
The
cover.
I love the cover. The cover designer is amazing. Um, yeah, and I've felt like it's been a good journey so far. So I mean, I did try the traditional route because when you start writing, you sort of I had in my mind that this is the way it's going to go. You get an agent, you get published with a big publisher, um, and then I had a friend who was also publishing with this Canadian publisher. It's called Rising Action, and I talked to her about her journey. She was very happy with it as well. So I thought, well, in the end, I really want my book in the hands of readers. So, like, this is what the lifelong goal I've had, and it's it's all happening. So, it's been a great experience. I think I would definitely not say that I am not interested in an agent and the big publisher, and I just think that this was the route that my journey was taking me on, and so far it's been incredible.
That's amazing, and it's such an incredible feeling. And to be clear, going with a big publisher or getting scooped up by a big publisher doesn't guarantee the book tour. And it sounds like, it sounds like your friend's experience is a little bit singular. I really don't want to perpetuate this idea that, oh, you're going to be flown around the world on a private jet the second you sign with HarperCollins. That is also a little bit unusual, but it's interesting that you've been able to sort of compare notes on the process. And will your publisher distribute into the U.S. market at all, or will it be largely Canadian availability?
So it's going to be available in Canada and the US. It's on the Barnes and Noble site right now as pre-order. It's also available in the UK,
Great.
um, but it'll be in store in Canada in our large book chain in Canada.
That's amazing.
So
That's amazing
yeah.
distribution. Um,
Hmm.
So, all right, it's coming out. Are you working on another project? What is, you checked the box, the big box that everybody listening wants to check. You checked it. Now what?
Yeah. Well, this is where my story is sort of a little even more convoluted
Ah,
and
I love it. Tell
strange.
me.
Um, so that second book that I wrote and I had shelved,
Ah,
I had queried it, but I don't know if this is why, but I was querying it in 2020 when,
yeah.
the world had shut down and things were a little strange. Um,
An understatement. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And it did well in terms of getting requests from agents. Nothing eventually came out of it in the time that, that I had decided it was time to shelve it at. So I shelved it and then left it from 2020 until last year. And that's when I saw there was a UK publisher who is digital first.
Oh,
And yeah, they were looking for manuscripts. So I sent them that book and they offered on that book. And then because it had a very specific setting, they wanted me to write a second book.
okay.
So, yeah, so I now have this other two book deal with this digital first UK publisher. So it's definitely not traditional, but along the way, I've done a lot of research into, which route, and I've read all the articles on, the different paths in publishing. And I think for me, I'm like, well, I will have a book come out. I want to see how it goes, see how I feel about it, and then see what the next step is after that.
I think that's really actually interesting, and it might seem convoluted, but there's not just one path, and there's not just one path for one person, and there's not just one path for one project. There
Hmm.
are digital first, there are audio originals that
Yeah.
people are selling. There are so many different routes. You said, I care about getting my stories in the hands of readers, or in the ears of readers, if you ever go the audio route, and these are all means to an end, right? And I
Hmm.
think it's so refreshing to sort of break from that that path, which of course is desirable, right? Your friend is having a grand
Yes.
old time with
Yep.
a big five publisher, but it's not the only route. And I think that people get a little bit in a mental box about it sometimes.
Yeah, I do think I've said all along. I think it would be great to have a partner in my career. I'd like to make it a long term career, and having a partner in my career would be fantastic. But um, I think along the way, I haven't gotten to that point yet. So along the way, I'm testing out these different waters and seeing how it goes.
Yeah, until they come along, it sounds like you are very open-minded, very proactive, and just trucking along. So this will be relatable, I think, to a lot of writers. You had the first manuscript that was basically a training ground, right? It
Yeah.
may never see the light of day. It could. I've spoken to writers who've dusted off their first efforts, their sophomore efforts, like you did with this one. How so the two questions that I get asked a lot. First, how do you know something is ready to submit?
Right. Um, well, I I went through the path of, you write it for as long as you think you need to write it until you can no longer
You're so sick of it,
do
you
anything else.
can't even.
Yes. And then I have worked with freelance editors as well. I know it can be a little cost prohibitive, but I had a chance to work with a freelance editor on my second book.
Hmm.
Got some really wonderful advice. I took the manuscript away, worked on it again. I had beta readers, made revisions again. And I think at some point I just sort of realized that it's gone through many revisions. I've rewritten it, I've revised, and at this point, I can't do anything more with it. And that's when I feel like it's ready to submit.
Yeah, it's
Um,
it's gonna do what it's gonna do You've gotten the
Right.
feedback. I work as a freelance editor, so obviously,
Mhm.
I'm not going to say don't do, but I'm
Yeah.
not biased at all in terms of recommending outside readers, whether they're beta readers, whether they're paid. But you sort of it ran its course for the development of it. No new ideas were forthcoming. It sounds like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I felt like it was a strong book in my in my standards. I felt like I was happy with it and I got it to where it want or where I could get it.
Yeah.
Um but after working with editors on the books that, are now going to be published, it's interesting to see how much they can help you with what you think is already a really strong book. Um
Well, you've also
so
learned a lot too.
yeah.
I was gonna ask, you got to that point of readiness with the second manuscript, and now you've had the opportunity to revisit it in kind of a post acquisitions kind of more professional setting. So I was really curious, did so it's probably been like 4 years since you last
Mm.
actively dug into it. You're a new person as far as writing goes. You've had a lot of time away from it during which your brain has maybe been doing back burner stuff about it and thinking about it. And now you have a new raft of feedback on it. So are you just blown away by how different it seems to you now?
Yeah, I think when I reread it again, as after not touching it for so long, I thought like I feel like I'm a different writer now.
You
So
are.
yeah, so when I went through it, um, I was making a lot of changes because it was even just sort of sentence structure or like there was a whole plot point that I thought, how did I miss that? But I think for me, I have noticed that time away is one of the most important things that I can do when it comes to my writing. And I used to feel like I was in a rush. So I used to hear take time, and someone said, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and
Nobody
I was
does
like,
it. Nobody does it at first.
no, because I thought I don't have 4 to 6 weeks to not look at it. And
Yep.
I've realized now that that is the best thing for me is, really getting away from it and coming back with fresh eyes. And I can't do that in a week or 2 weeks.
Yep.
I need a lot of space.
And so let me ask you this. When you felt it had run its course, you went on submission with it the first time, it didn't end up doing what you wanted, it didn't end up getting interest. How do you decide to put something away? That's another question that I get a lot.
Yeah. So the funny thing is it didn't get interest in terms of an offer, but it did have quite a few requests, like full requests and some partial requests and, an R&R. Um, the reason I usually set something aside is because when I'm querying, I go on to the next project to take my mind off of the querying process. Um, so what I found was after I had queried it for a certain amount of time, I think I could have given it some space, gone back to work on it again, started querying again. Um, but I set it aside because I was now writing this other one and I was interested more in the other one. So I've had friends in my writer group who, have stuck with that first or second manuscript and they just keep going back to it. And I think that's great. That's probably a really good way to, revise and work on your work. But I sort of wanted to move on to the next. So I set it aside whenever I was, ready to move on.
And I think that's really valuable experience too, because they're never truly gone because they're in a drawer. You can dust them off again once you have some time or some additional insight, or maybe the market was not interested in a zombie story back then because it was saturated, but these things are cyclical and now you want to dust it off. So it's never truly gone. I do think that some projects do run their course. They are
Hmm.
more a learning experience, like maybe your first manuscript was. But if there's something there, and if you're getting like R&Rs, that's a revise and resubmit letter from agents, and there's potential interest, you don't have to kind of dig in and give it all you've got right in that moment. You can take a pause like you did and still have a good outcome with that project.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, I learned that doing the writing was the best practice for me as well. So, you know, I also remember hearing a published author speak once, and she said she wrote, 3 books to get her published with her first one. And I remember also thinking, like, oh my goodness, that is so much work. How can you do that? And then I got into the process and realized, well, it's practice and it's making me better. And even if, with that first manuscript will go nowhere ever, but it was practice. And
Yeah.
so it wasn't wasted time at all.
No, and people are so sick of me saying this, but I say no time spent writing or reading is ever wasted. You need
Hmm.
that downtime sometimes. You need to take breaks. You need to make a pivot, but it's all grist for the mill. And I can already see some people rolling their eyes because I say that all the time, but it's true. Writing is one of those practices where it's like yoga. I got really upset at first when I started doing yoga. Not like I do a ton of yoga, but when the teacher kept calling it a practice. And I was like, I don't want to practice. I want to win.
Yeah.
And that's like you saying, I don't have 4 weeks. I need to do
Yeah.
this yesterday. But the more you get into it, I think that initial fervor dies down a little bit and mellows into something more mature. That every writer, you can listen to all the writing advice in the world, you can read all the writing reference books, but it doesn't click until you go through it yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened with me. I was in a rush and I just thought, like, this has to happen and I have to make it happen quickly. I don't know why I thought that. And then
Human
uh,
nature, probably.
yeah, after going through the process of, having a lot of interest but never quite getting there, I thought, okay, I think now it's time to take time and like treat this as like, an art and a craft, and like remember why I really love writing, because that was why I started, because I love writing and I can't imagine not doing it. And I thought to myself, would I still write if, nothing ever gets published? And to me the answer was yes.
Yeah.
So that was when I realized I need to just calm down a little bit. Take it a little slower.
Yeah, that internal pressure can be really really tough to wrangle with, but I don't think that a lot of good comes from this stressed writer trying to meet an
Yeah.
arbitrary deadline. You can stress about the real deadlines later, but those
Yeah.
self-inflicted deadlines aren't very helpful to the creative process. Thanks so much for tuning in so far to the Good Story Podcast. If you like our writing resources, we have collected them all in an on-demand vault for the Good Story Learning membership. For one low monthly fee, you can dig through everything that we have ever made for writers: webinars, long form video classes, downloadables, handouts, all of it, as well as join our Discord writing community to connect with like-minded writers and all of the Good Story Company editors in there as well for advice, critique connections, anything you could possibly want to take a break from the long and isolated work of crafting your story. So come join us, goodstorycompany.com/membership, and it is called Good Story Learning. So let's talk about your category. So you say suspense. I called it a thriller. You were like, that's not quite it. What's the difference to you?
I think the reason I say that is because I think thriller readers, they expect like huge twists and, didn't see that coming kind of turns. And um I heard a podcast refer to what I feel Burlington is. Sorry, they referred to a category called like neighborhood drama. And I was like, "Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that's what I've written, which is like neighborhood drama. It's suspenseful, but I wouldn't say it's as thrilling as, thrillers that are currently out there right now. So that's why I tend to, I don't want readers to be disappointed. So that's why I shy away a little bit from the thriller. Um,
I think it's very important in categories to pay attention to audience expectations, and a lot of
mhm.
writers sort of bulk at that a little bit, but if you're writing romance and you don't have a happily ever after or happy for now, you're unless it's like very very intentional, you're in trouble. And so I think it's interesting that you're cautious about thriller. To me, thriller is so mystery is what happened. Thriller is more something bad is gonna happen unless I intervene or whatever. But you do have a missing friend, even if it's not just an international cabal of evil something or other behind it, it is a group of Stepford type people, or people with secrets perpetrating something. It does seem like there's a element of danger for the character to get involved in. Are the stakes life or death, or are they not?
yeah, I would say they are. But I guess I remember reading, uh, oh my goodness, I can't remember the name of Celeste Ng's really big book.
Oh yeah, the Little Fires Everywhere, which the
Yes.
colors of your cover reminded me of that cover a little bit.
Yeah, I did. I remember. Well, I love Celesting very much, and I
Yes.
read Little Fires Everywhere, and I remember hearing someone refer to it as a thriller, and afterwards I was surprised because I thought,
Yeah.
oh, that's not what I thought of as thriller. But I guess when you describe it that way, it is. It yeah, it does have those elements.
Well, it's sort
Um,
of it's the ticking time bomb with the baby story, and we're building up to this sort of like family fracture, even if it's not murder. I think murder and thriller tend to go kind of hand in hand in people's perception. Yeah, that's an interesting one because to me, I'm like, okay, ensemble cast, definitely some suspense, some pretty incendiary, pun fully intended, kind of dynamics. We have the racism, we have secrets coming to light, we have kind of different people coming at different situations from different angles. So there's like a ticking clock. It gathers momentum as everything ties together. And I think that kind of the multiple chronologies, multiple points of view contributes to all of that. But yeah, is that suspense? I'm also thinking with your pitch for your book, I'm thinking of, and you've been comped to Leanne Moriarty. So I'm thinking of Big Little Lies as kind of the newcomer to this established society, social circle, the school kind of setting. And I'm also thinking about Kristen Chandler's The Husbands, which is, there's something rotten in this planned community. The Husbands does have life or death stakes. So does Big Little Lies. But are you not building to a big reveal? You don't obviously have to say what it is, but is it predicated on some kind of secret?
yes, yeah, there is. Yep, there is, and I think, yeah, that's why I think it has been kind of falling in this like suspense thriller category. Um, so I do think it falls along a lot of the same lines of what people would expect. I think the thriller category is so interesting because there are so many out there that are very dramatic and big, really big stakes, and I I feel like those are often very plot driven.
Hmm.
Um, so I think the only difference with Burlington is I feel I tried to go a little bit more character driven. Um, Not to say that these really well done thrillers out there are not character,
I think
heavy.
they all are. That's just
Yeah,
table stakes in this category.
right. Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's a little, I think it's funny because when people ask me what I write and I would say women's fiction, sometimes that confused um, people because they didn't really understand women's fiction and sort of equated immediately with romance, which is which is great, which is fine, but
Yeah.
mine don't tend to have romance in them. But I'm writing about a woman, usually protagonist, who is kind of leading a regular life, and then something happens that is, out of the ordinary, that puts them into this journey. And it's often, around the lines of things that we all kind of want. Like, we're looking for belonging in this book.
Mhm.
Themes of belonging, feeling valued and heard, and finding your place. Um, Motherhood is a big theme I write about in all my books as well. Um, so I do feel like it's been sort of hard for me to narrow down exactly what I write. And maybe that's why I'm like, I have trouble with saying, yes, it's this, or it's, no, it's this, because I didn't set out to write one specific thing.
Yeah. But I do think that it is a category, this women's fiction leaning thriller or suspense. And I do think
Yeah.
suspense is a little lighter than thriller. So,
Yeah.
you can sort of dip your toe in the water of suspense and labeling yourself. But it's a huge
Hmm.
category right now. And so it seems like whether or not you feel comfortable claiming a label, you're in a hot vein in the market, just
Yeah.
based on who you are and what you're interested in, and what is really developed around that type of story. And what do you think is driving readers to not just women's fiction like an Emma Straub that's very concerned with relationships and kind of intergenerational stuff, but to these darker undercurrents, the danger that is sort of stitched into some of these thriller suspense stories?
Um, well, I have this part to me where I think, say I'll be sitting at like the soccer field watching my kid play soccer, and then I'm like, ooh, what if this happened right now? And so I have this side to me where I always wonder, like, life is just going along normally, and then what if this happened? And I think these books kind of explore that, and they're very, you can't imagine it happening. So
Yeah,
I think reading about it is, to me, it's always been also escapism. Like, it's just what I absolutely love to do is be entertained and read a story that, entertains me, but also makes me think.
yeah.
Um, and that also makes me feel kind of seen and heard as well.
Do you think I mean, we joke about it now, but murder documentaries, true crime podcasts, do you think that it's a way of exploring some of our anxieties around change and around uncertainty and this what if question? That's not kind of book fodder for me. When I ask the what if question, I feel like my anxiety kind of flaring up, and I feel like whenever we put voice to that and we add some, larger than life story reveals and secrets and kind of juicy stuff, is that also a way of reaffirming that we're safe, and that if something bad happened, we could make it. We could be resilient, we could triumph.
Yeah, I actually think that's definitely, I think people like to know what happened so that they can understand it and be sure that it won't happen to them. So, um, read about is, can you imagine, your child being taken away from you? And, I'm going to read this story, see what happened to make sure that, like, I know this won't happen to me. Um, and I think that when it's in the form of, book or TV or movie or podcast, um, there feels like there's a little bit of separation. Like, this isn't real.
Yeah,
So I know I'm safe. But, I think sometimes too, some of the books like this thriller and suspense, uh, they explore sides of you that I think you don't want to admit. are there
Mhm.
as well. Um, and in an exaggerated way again, so you can feel like, well, I'm not like that, so I'm okay.
And
Um,
how do you balance? Because if a character is all prickly or all dark side, um, that can be problematic for readers to hook into, unless
yeah,
they're like feeling morally superior. But you don't really want to feel morally superior to your main character. You want to relate. So how do you
yeah.
balance that when you're creating a character who does make mistakes and who does have kind of unkind thoughts, that none of us want to really admit to, or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, that is a tricky ongoing process, I think, because I have heard in the past, in early drafts that a character maybe was unlikable
Yep.
or so I think I've just had to, really focus on like little details that will make readers feel connected to them. Um,
Like what? Give me an example.
well, if I'm like writing, a friend or something, I try to think of someone that I think has qualities that I really admire and try to put those little like details into the character. Um, or for example, in Burlington, um, I felt insecure about certain things when I was a new mother. And so I wrote in details of the way I felt and like the things I wore and that kind of thing to make the character feel more vulnerable and real. And maybe somebody else out there will relate to that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, those kind of details.
I think my favorite moments when I read are when I've never quite seen that in a book, and I think we're
Oh,
having a lot of conversations about representation and people recognizing themselves in stories. But it's like somebody else had that thought. That's such a weird thought, and
mm,
it's not even like the broad stroke stuff sometimes. You're right. I think it's the relatable specifics that really hook a reader.
yeah.
How do you go about manufacturing stakes? Because you've learned now you want to shy away from saying, I don't have the highest stakes in the world. It's not
Mhm.
a thriller per se. You're kind of softening that characterization a little bit, but you still have learned that high stakes kind of are a make or break, if
Yes.
that's fair to say. So how do you create them? Because I think you're right, but I think a lot of writers struggle with, well, what even is that and how do I do it? Because I know it's important, but I don't. Like, help me.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I was reading about, creating character arcs, like I think a lot of writers know about, what does your writer want? What do they need? What's going to stand in the way of
Yeah.
them getting what they want? But then I also read that someone I think had said, what is the absolute worst thing that could happen to your character? And at what moment? Not just the worst thing, but like at the worst time.
Yeah.
And I thought that's a really good way to raise stakes because it's very easy to think about a character and once you know them to think, oh yeah, well this would be the absolute worst thing that could happen to them. So how can I work that in a realistic way at the right time? Um, and I think timing is very key as well.
So that strikes me as more like the climactic sort of the
Right.
pressure, right? That
Yeah.
comes at the worst possible time. And I think that's amazing to work in. What about smaller stuff? You can't just have one sort of instance of high stakes, right?
Right. Yeah. When I was learning about structure, I learned that, there are some certain points, like there's they can be called different things, I think, but there was the inciting incident was a moment where something big has to happen, high stakes. And then first key event is what I heard it called as well, like right before the midpoint.
Hmm.
Um, and then it might have been second key event, or it might have been like right before the climax again. There were all these little kind of parts where you had to keep raising stakes and something had to change, and something had to happen that caused change. So I think in each story, that's what I'm trying to, before I start, I try to think about what is going to happen at certain points. And that's the way I can really fill in the rest and
And
keep the stakes high.
what are you pulling from in your toolbox? Is so it can't all be unexpected events, they have to
Yeah.
come from within the story and within the character, and the character has to be proactive too. So are you pulling on developments in the character? Are you pulling on secrets? Are you pulling on reveals? Are you pulling on character relationships? Are you pulling on, the truck that barrels through town and kind of messes everything up? What are some of your favorite kind of tactics?
Um, well, I love books with secrets, so I do love family secrets especially. So I like to use the secrets. I do often find I like to pull on, like, the character, you know, something they learn about themselves
Mm.
and something that they, a realization. Um, and then sometimes it is a big plot point, like it is a big, this just happened in, and I think for me it depends on the story, but I tend to really, I like the secrets and I like the character reveals about themselves.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
it's interesting to sort of mix those up. And are you a big outliner now that you've pantsed, you learned
Yeah,
all the stuff? Are you sort of now fully plotter, or is it a mix of both?
I'd say I'm a mix of both because I like to have an idea of what's going to happen at what point to keep my story going so that I don't sort of flounder.
Hmm.
Um, but things do usually change as I start writing and go along. But I definitely need some kind of structure, a little bit of structure, or else uh, I do just sort of, I flounder when I write.
And how many characters do you play with? Because we sort of were talking about Little Fires Everywhere. That's more of an ensemble cast. It follows three pretty distinct narrative pieces and weaves
Hmm.
them together. Is yours a little bit more focused on the one protagonist and some secondary characters?
Yeah, yeah, it would be mostly her story, and it's, yeah, one point of view. And then there are, friends, and then there's her family. But for the most part, I focused on, just the one point of view. I would love to write. I love ensemble cast books and movies. I think that seems really difficult, though. Really difficult.
And how do you design those people? What is your thought process when you're like, okay, she needs some friends, she needs some enemies, and she needs some problematic family members?
Yeah.
What's your approach with teasing out some personalities?
Well, I think I'm not sure if everyone does this and how long you can do it for, but I do pull from real life quite often. And, like, so the husband in this book was kind of modeled after my husband. Um, so my husband's name is Andrew, and the guy in this book is Drew. So I didn't even really try very hard in that point to change it. But
Is he flattered or horrified by his portrayal?
I'm not sure. So actually, the funny thing was that at first, the husband character was not really well liked in the book in early readers. And I think it's because I knew him so well that I didn't put enough of him on the page because
Hmm.
I knew him. And I thought, oh, well, everybody knows. So I had to put more of him, like, on the page to get him to that stage. And with, with friends, with, kids, I pull little details from real life. So, if my kids did, had this certain aspect to them, I put it into the kids in the book. Um, yeah, and
Yeah.
even for the main character, it has a lot of parts of me as well. So
Is it going to be tough to write? So you've sort of, like you said, you don't, it's not an inexhaustible fountain of friends and family that you can pull from forever. Is it going to
yeah,
be tough to attempt? And do you have any interest in attempting a character who's very, very different, where you have a little bit less of that foundational life experience?
I think that's. what I enjoy a lot about writing too is the challenge. So, moving on to the next, what can I do next and what will be more of a challenge, and getting it right. Definitely getting it right. If you're not telling your story specifically, or a story you can tell specifically, if you are going to tell something a little bit out of your realm of understanding, then it's important to definitely get it right. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think I would love to work on multiple characters who are very different. I think it's deciding what I want to challenge myself with next.
I love that. Heather Dixon, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody go check out Burlington, your debut. And get, thank you for sharing your path. And I'm excited, especially to see where you go next. You already have kind of a duology in the works, but yeah, I have no doubt it's going to be interesting. And thank you so much for sharing these thoughts. I think you just have so much to say about all the different elements of craft. So
Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it too. It's been great. I love chatting about this stuff.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for listening. My name is Mary Kole, and here's to a good story. Thanks so much for joining me. This has been Good Story Podcast with me, Mary Kole. I just want to offer a heartfelt thank you and bit of gratitude to the entire Good Story Company team. You can find out more at goodstorycompany.com. And of course, to all of you listening and taking the time to really dig into these conversations with me, this has been Good Story Podcast, and here's to a good story.